presenting history's best on PBS.
This documentary series has been made possible by grants from the following: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the annual financial support from viewers like you, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Summerlee Foundation, and the following organizations and individuals.
By the spring of 1846, a border dispute between the United States and Mexico had exploded into war. In bloody fighting on the Texas battlefields of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, U.S. troops had pushed Mexican forces south of the Rio Grande. By the end of June, a second U.S. Army was on the march west, and the war would sweep across the continent into the Mexican borderlands of New Mexico and California, there to be stopped only by the waters of the Pacific Ocean. The war for the borderlands would forever change the lives of its people. Many would be forced to accept a new identity under a foreign flag. Others would choose to fight to the death. Later that year, U.S. troops would attack Mexico's northern provincial capital of Monterrey. For the first time, Mexicans would be forced to defend themselves street by street and house by house. On May 13, 1846, U.S. President James K. Polk signed a congressional declaration of war against Mexico. The president's objective was to secure the Texas border. Then he would try and force Mexico to sell its northern territories of New Mexico and California to the United States. Each was a valuable prize. The Santa Fe Trail through New Mexico was the most important commercial route in the West. And California's deep water harbors would give the United States access to more profitable trade routes across the Pacific. Immediately, Polk acted on a three-part strategy. First, he ordered the Navy to blockade Mexico's coastlines. Zachary Taylor's army, fresh off its victories on the Rio Grande, would push into northeastern Mexico. And a second army would march west to occupy New Mexico and California. If Mexico would not sell its borderlands, Polk would take them by force. At Fort Leavenworth in present-day Kansas, more than 1,600 U.S. soldiers, including 1,000 volunteers from Missouri, prepared to head west along the Santa Fe Trail. The Army of the West was led by Colonel Stephen W. Kearny, a tough, disciplined career officer with 30 years' experience on the Western Plains. Kearny's orders were to march the 900 miles from Fort Leavenworth to Santa Fe and occupy New Mexico. From Santa Fe, he was to continue another 1,000 miles to California. There he would meet the naval warships sent by Polk and take California too. The assignment was to conquer half a continent, and Kearny was ready to begin. In late June of 1846, he ordered his men west.
The prairies but the sea of grass o'er which our wagons roll. We'll reach the Arkansas at last and then old Mexico.
The soldiers marched across rolling fields of grass that slowly gave way to vast stretches of barren terrain.
General Kearny is a rough old man, for this we only know. He's marched us some 800 miles to fight old Mexico.
Indians, who had never seen so many white men on the trail, watched in amazement as the seemingly endless columns churned up a cloud of dust that hung suspended for miles across the horizon. The Army included a survey party led by Lieutenant William Emery. Emery's mission was to survey possible railroad routes, to lay the groundwork for the expansion of the United States westward. That the United States would expand, he had no doubt.
The road presents few obstacles for a railway, and if it continues as good to the Pacific, it will be one of the routes over which the United States will pass immense quantities of merchandise into what may become in time the rich and populous states of Sonora, Durango, and Southern California.
For now, California was almost 2,000 miles away. The trail would lead first to New Mexico. New Mexico was one of the most populous provinces on Mexico's northern frontier. Yet outside the safety of a few settlements like Santa Fe, Taos, and Albuquerque, New Mexico was Indian territory. Ever since the Spanish conquest, settlers had lived among Pueblo Indians, Navajos, Apaches, Comanches, and Utes. Relations between them had long been marked by outbreaks of violence and rebellion.
On the eve of the war with Mexico, relations with Indians had actually worsened rather than improved. And one sees that in the laments of frontiersmen as they beg the central government for military help.
The territory's governor, Manuel Armijo, sought help from Mexico City. But to wait for protection from the central government, wrote one New Mexican, would be to wait in vain.
We are surrounded on all sides by many tribes of heartless barbarians, almost perishing. And our brothers, instead of helping us, are at each other's throats in their festering civil wars.
The people of the capital city of Mexico were very preoccupied with resolving political problems concerned with the formation of the state and of the government. And this caused them to concentrate more on the center of the country. And the frontier was not attended to with the care and the concern that it merited at the time.
Forced to rely on themselves, many New Mexicans looked to the Santa Fe Trail and new opportunities for trade with the United States.
Mexico put itself in the position of the sheep inviting the lion to come dine, and the lion came. That is to say, the mercantile conquest of what would become the southwestern part of the United States really was the real conquest.
The trail brought New Mexicans items they could not get as easily from Mexico: iron and steel tools, medicine, machine-made textiles. The wagon trains also brought North American traders, and many came to stay. One of the most successful of these was an entrepreneur named Charles Bent. Based in Taos, Bent was part owner of a trading post on the Santa Fe Trail, north of the U.S.-New Mexico border. The post was called Bent's Fort. It was managed by Charles' brother, William. Both men had married into prominent families. William was married to Owl Woman, the daughter of a Cheyenne holy man. Charles was married to Maria Ignacia Jaramillo, cousin to Governor Armijo. But some New Mexicans saw the growing influence of the Bents and others like them as a threat. As the number of traders increased, Armijo became alarmed.
Armijo then, early on, warned the Mexican government against people like Bent. Later, when it became clear that there was going to be no help from Mexico to stem the flow of immigrants, then Armijo tended to befriend those very immigrants, go into business with them, and find, as a practical matter, the best way to get along with them was to join them.
Armijo was a shrewd businessman. Even now, the governor had wagons of his own coming down the Santa Fe Trail. What he did not know was that this time, the trail would also bring an invading army. On July 29, 1846, Stephen Kearny's Army of the West reached Bent's Fort. 1,600 men and 20,000 animals crowded into the fort's plaza and sprawled across the surrounding plain. From inside an upstairs room, a young woman named Susan McGoffin lay ill on her bed. McGoffin and her husband had been on their way to Chihuahua with a wagon train full of merchandise. The war had overtaken them, and McGoffin marveled at the commotion outside.
July 1846. The shoeing of horses, neighing and braying of mules, the crying of children, the scolding and fighting of men are all enough to turn my head. The fort is crowded to overflowing. Colonel Kearny has arrived, and it seems as if the world is coming with him.
For 3 days, Kearny allowed his troops to rest. The soldiers had marched more than 600 miles through blistering heat and choking dust. Now they could drink juleps made with brown sugar and Taos whiskey. Their stay was short. Kearny was eager to move on. On August 2nd, the Army of the West left Bent's Fort and crossed the Arkansas River into New Mexico. In Santa Fe, Governor Armijo was told that the army was coming, but there was little he could do with the few regular troops at his command. Still, he urged all New Mexicans to resist.
Let us be comrades in arms. Rest assured that your governor is willing and ready to sacrifice his life and all his interest in the defense of his country.
During the next few days, between 3,000 and 4,000 poorly armed New Mexicans gathered where the Santa Fe Trail wound through a narrow pass here at Apache Canyon. Told that the New Mexicans were waiting for them, the U.S. troops descended into the Narrows, sure that the screams of the enemy would soon pierce the air. But at the bottom of the canyon, the U.S. soldiers were met by only eerie silence. Despite protests from his own men, Armijo had ordered the New Mexicans to disband. The governor had fled south to Chihuahua.
Why? One of the great mysteries. But certainly part of his calculation must have been that his forces were not particularly well armed. Many of the New Mexicans fought against Indians with bows and arrows.
Kearny's troops passed through Apache Canyon unopposed. That same afternoon, they entered Santa Fe.
Black eyes looked through the latticed windows at our column of cavaliers, some gleaming with pleasure and others filled with tears. Strange indeed must have been the feelings of the citizens, all the future of their destiny vague and uncertain. Their new rulers, strangers to their manners, language, and habits. Richard Elliott, St. Louis Reveille.
In the plaza at the heart of the city, U.S. soldiers raised the stars and stripes above the governor's palace, and Kearny read a proclamation he had issued in each town along the way. The acting governor of New Mexico then spoke in response.
Do not find it strange if there has been no manifestation of joy and enthusiasm in seeing this city occupied by your military forces. To us, the power of the Mexican Republic is dead. No matter what her condition, she was our mother.
With the occupation in place, Kearny worked to establish a provisional government. One of his first duties was to meet with a delegation of Pueblo Indians. Centuries earlier, the Pueblos had greeted the arrival of the Spanish with curiosity and hospitality.
And when the Americans came, I think the whites, as opposed to the Spanish Mexicans, I think that there was a different relationship, because the relationship between the Mexican and the native people was already tinged by a lot of atrocities and wars and greed, if you may. And by the time that I think the Americans came, there was a lot of mistrust, and rightly so.
Lieutenant William Emery knew that the Pueblos had more than once risen in revolt against the Spanish and Mexican authorities.
300 years of oppression and injustice have failed to extinguish in this race the recollection that they were once the peaceable and inoffensive masters of the country. They are our fast friends now and forever.
The lieutenant did not know that before long his fellow Americans would be seen as the oppressors, and that bloodshed would follow. Near the end of September 1846, Kearny marched for California with a company of dragoons and Lieutenant Emery's survey party. Before leaving, he appointed Charles Bent as the new territorial governor of New Mexico. The decision angered many New Mexicans.
Many people who had been there for a long time, whose family was very, very influential, believed that even though they might not have welcomed the Americans with open arms, that they would have a place in the new regime. They do not get that place, and they're very resentful of it. At the same time, there are many people who are proud of their Hispanic heritage, and they see Americans as relatively uncultured people who were coming in and who were occupying their land.
Resistance to the new government spread. In Taos, on the cold night of January 19, 1847, Charles Bent was at home with his family. Suddenly, New Mexican and Pueblo Indian rebels kicked in the door. Certain that he was loved by the people of his adopted hometown, Bent tried to calm the intruders. His daughter, Teresina, was 5 years old at the time. Later, she recalled what happened that night.
Father told them, "What wrong have I done to you? When you come to me for help, I always helped you and your families. Yes, you did, but you have to die now so that no American is going to govern us." Then they commenced to shoot with the arrows and guns.
The men threw the mortally wounded Bent to the floor and scalped him alive. The revolt spread quickly throughout the region. Rebels set fire to stores and homes. U.S. citizens and those thought to be sympathizers were tortured and killed. Padre Antonio Jose Martinez, a popular priest and educator, opened his home to terrified families seeking refuge from the violence. Martinez called for an end to the bloodshed, but the revolt would claim the lives of many more. On February 3rd, Colonel Sterling Price and his U.S. troops arrived at Taos Pueblo, where 700 rebels and their families had dug themselves in.
There may have been a lot of fear at that time, but then there was also the feeling that this force could be repelled.
The battle began with a blast of U.S. artillery. For hours, the battery pounded at the walls of the Pueblo. Many inside sought the safety of the heavily defended church. But on the second day, U.S. soldiers hacked through the church's wall and fired a cannon into the breach. Dragoons set the roof on fire. The screams of the wounded echoed into the mountains. Some escaped into the open fields, where they were ridden down and killed. Those who were there said the creek running through the Pueblo turned red with blood. When it was over, Colonel Price reported 150 New Mexicans and Pueblo Indians dead. U.S. casualties were 7 dead and 45 wounded. Price wasted little time in bringing the rebel leaders to trial. 15 defendants were sentenced to death, 1 for high treason. Padre Martinez called the proceedings frightful and pleaded with Colonel Price for justice.
The prosecutor and defense attorneys speak only English, without explaining to them in Castilian the misfortune that they are being notified of condemnation. And finally, I neglected to mention the quality of the sentencing jury. a class of ignorant men tainted with passion.
From rooftops, the people of Taos watched as the convicted men were hanged. Louis Girard, a young adventurer from the United States, helped cut down the bodies. With the execution of those for murder, he wrote, no fault should be found. But for a man to rise in defense of his native country and be hanged for treason, that, Girard thought, was an atrocity most damnable.
On the curve of the river, fringed with large cottonwoods, the moon shone brightly, and all was as still as death, except when a flock of geese or sand cranes were disturbed in their repose. Lieutenant William Emery.
South by the Rio Grande, then west towards the Gila River, the 110 men under Stephen Kearny's command marched into the wilderness. The tiny band of soldiers was guided by Kit Carson, the already legendary Taos trapper. Carson had warned them all. The journey would be hard. At the end, the men would be starving. Lieutenant Emery wondered if they would survive, even as he coolly measured the features of a strange new world.
Strolling over the hills alone, I was struck with the fact that not one object in the whole view, animal, vegetable, or mineral, had anything in common with the products of any state in the Union, with the single exception of the cottonwood.
Emery marveled at what he called the perfect stillness and quietude of the landscape. For the native peoples he was soon to meet, this was sacred ground.
Most Indian people, and particularly some of the Indian people in the Southwest, have a very deep religious connection with their lands. Their gods are in the land themselves. For many Native American people, history, as we understand it, is as much a function of place as it is of time.
The soldiers marched over cedar and pine-covered hills, making their way through the land of the Apache Indians. Emery wrote that the Apaches they met saw the U.S. soldiers as allies. For generations, the Apaches and the Spanish had waged war against each other. Now, the Mexican government was paying handsomely for Apache scalps.
One of the chiefs broke out in a vehement manner. "You have taken New Mexico and will soon take California. Go then, and take Chihuahua, Durango, and Sonora. We will help you. The Mexicans are rascals. We hate and will kill them all."
Native American people have often been able to retain our autonomy by balancing one colonial power against another. The problem, of course, with Kearny's occupation of the American Southwest is that the balance now is gone, and Indian people then find themselves at the mercy of the Americans, which in many instances proved to be disastrous.
For the Native Americans of the Southwest, Kearny's passage would signal the beginning of the most bitter and tragic chapter in the history of their people. But here, beneath the distant sky, the men of Kearny's command could not have seemed so significant. Beyond the Colorado River, past ancient abandoned cities, past the cultivated fields of the Pima and Maricopa tribes, across the desert lands of the Mojave Indians. With every labored step, the soldiers pushed the U.S. frontier westward to California. California. This Mexican territory lay so far from Mexico City that its people were called those from the other shore. About 7,000 Californios lived here, mostly along the coast. For many, it was a good life. California's harbors had become busy ports of call for trading ships from many nations. Cowhides from the region were so popular they were known as California banknotes. Among the rancheros who profited most from the growing economy was Mariano Vallejo. His vast land holdings included some 150,000 acres in the Sonoma Valley, north of San Francisco Bay. Over the years, Vallejo had built his reputation and his estate by faithfully serving Mexico as an officer in the army. But like other Californios, Vallejo had come to resent Mexico's neglect of the region.
The Mexican government did not have on the frontier a single horse, rifle, cannon, or soldier. For a long time, there was not a soldier in the garrison who did not receive his food and clothing but out of what I gave him, Mariano Vallejo.
In the 1830s, the isolated Californios began to welcome settlers from other countries. About 60 miles from Vallejo's home, a trading post on the Sacramento River called Sutter's Fort attracted a large colony of immigrants from the United States. Each year brought more wagons streaming across the mountains. The tide was rising in part because of the exploits of a man known as the Pathfinder. Captain John Charles Fremont was arrogant and reckless, but he was also one of the most famous explorers of his time. Fremont's reputation was built on the work of his wife, Jessie, a talented writer who edited his journals and reports into books that inspired thousands to head west.
Our neighbors got hold of Fremont's story of California and Oregon, brought the book to my husband to read, and he was carried away with the idea too. I said, "Oh, let us not go." Our neighbors, some of them old men and women, had large families, but it made no difference. We sold our home, and everything we could not take with us or sell, we gave away, and joined the company for California. Mary Annie Jones.
Mariano Vallejo viewed the growing colony of Americans in California with mixed emotions. Vallejo knew too well what had happened in Texas once Americans had outnumbered Mexican settlers.
Vallejo was fascinated with Americans because they represented for him a set of Republican ideals that he had been tracing from his youth from the time he read Rousseau. On the other hand, he also saw that Americans represented a threat to the well-being of California.
In December of 1845, Californios were both puzzled and concerned when Captain John Charles Fremont and 65 heavily armed men made their way out of the snow-laden mountains and into Sutter's Fort. The captain was supposed to be on a mapping mission for the U.S. government, but whatever his skills as an explorer, Fremont was no diplomat. In a dispute with local authorities, the hot-tempered captain planted a U.S. flag on a mountaintop for all to see. Californios were outraged, and Fremont avoided a fight only by heading north to Oregon. Still, the incident reinforced a hard truth for Californios. Their province was ripe for the taking. Mexico could not protect them. Some talked of independence, others of establishing an alliance with Britain or France. Mariano Vallejo argued that California's best hope lay in an alliance with the United States.
To rely any longer upon Mexico to govern and defend us would be idle and absurd. Why should we shrink from incorporating ourselves with the happiest and freest nation in the world, destined soon to be the most wealthy?
Vallejo's good opinion of Americans would soon be put to the test. 3 months after planting his flag in the mountains, Captain John Fremont came riding back to Sutter's Fort. By now, the U.S. settlers in the area were anxious and angry, certain they would be forced to leave California. No one knows for sure whether Fremont was acting under orders or on his own, but the captain suggested a plan. If the settlers took a few influential Californios prisoner, perhaps they could start a chain of events that would end with California under U.S. control. In the early dawn of June 14, 1846, Mariano Vallejo was awakened by a band of American settlers pounding on his door. One of them later described his companions.
Almost the whole party was dressed in leather hunting shirts. Many of them were greasy. They were about as rough-looking a set of men as one could well imagine. Anyone would feel some dread at falling into their hands.
Dressed in his military uniform, Vallejo faced the group. To what happy circumstances, Vallejo is reported to have said, shall I attribute the visit of so many exalted personages? The men declared that they were establishing an independent republic in California. General Vallejo was placed under arrest and forced to sign an official surrender. The Americans then helped themselves to Vallejo's brandy and wine. Soon they were shouting at each other, locked in a drunken debate over the wording of their Declaration of Independence. "Choose this day what you shall be," said one. "Either we are robbers or we must be conquerors." Later that morning in the plaza, the rebels raised a homemade flag featuring a crudely fashioned grizzly bear.
The robbers hoisted a piece of linen about the size of a large towel. In it was painted a red bear and a lone star. A band of ungrateful horse thieves, trappers, and runaway sailors. Rosalia Vallejo Lis.
Mariano Vallejo and his brother Salvador were taken under armed escort to Sutter's Fort. Vallejo had hoped that Fremont would release them. Instead, the captain ordered them held prisoner. Salvador Vallejo remembered it as a day of humiliation and betrayal.
My heart grieved for my brother when the light of day allowed me to see him lying on a damp floor without coverings or even a pillow on which to rest his head. I cursed the days in which our house dispensed hospitality to a race of men deaf to the call of gratitude, so perfect strangers to good breeding.
Sailing in the waters off the California coast, U.S. Commodore John D. Sloat cautiously entered Monterrey Harbor. In the event of a declaration of war, his orders were to occupy California's ports and, if possible, to bring about the peaceful annexation of the territory. But when told that Fremont and the Bear Flaggers had started a rebellion, Sloat knew he had to act. Doña María de las Angustias de la Guerra remembered the day clearly.
During the morning, the preparations could be seen. Many armed boats filled with men came ashore and took possession without any interference. There was no garrison, and I believe the only Mexican officer present was old Captain Mariano Silva. The conquest of California was not a pleasant event for the Californios, but I must confess that California was on the road to the most complete ruin.
When the Bear Flaggers heard the news from Monterrey, they replaced their flag with the Stars and Stripes. The independent Republic of California had lasted just 3 weeks. Five months later, in December of 1846, the exhausted soldiers of Stephen Kearny's command finally reached San Diego. The nearly 2,000-mile journey across the continent had landed them in the thick of war. Californios were fighting back against the U.S. occupation. Just 40 miles from the coast, near the village of San Pascual, Kearny's troops had suffered heavy casualties in a clash with a company of skilled Californio lancers. But the battle at San Pascual did little to change the course of the struggle for California. In late December, U.S. forces advanced on Los Angeles. At San Gabriel and again at La Mesa, the Californios fought bravely, but to no avail.
It was the last stand made by the sons of California for the liberty and independence of their country, whose defense will always do them honor. Guillermo Prieto.
By the time Mariano Vallejo learned of the fall of Los Angeles, he was back in Sonoma, still recovering from his 6-week captivity at Sutter's Fort.
I left Sutter's Fort half dead and arrived here almost without life, but am now much better. The political change has cost a great deal to my person and mind, and likewise to my property. All is lost, and the only hope for making it up is to work again.
Disillusioned with the United States and with Mexico, Vallejo was still forced to choose. In the plaza in front of his home, he carefully folded his Mexican military uniforms into a neat pile and burned them. The war in the Borderlands was over. But even with California and New Mexico under U.S. control, President Polk faced a frustrating predicament. He had the territories he wanted for the U.S., but he could not keep them unless Mexico surrendered. And this, Mexico would not do. But the U.S. invasion of Mexico would take place on more than one front. From Santa Fe, Colonel Alexander Doniphan would lead 900 Missouri volunteers into Chihuahua. General John E. Wool would march south from San Antonio. And General Zachary Taylor would prepare his army for a major offensive here on the Rio Grande.
Matamoros. Dear Julia, the 2 flowers you sent me come safe, but when I opened your letter, the wind blew them away, and I could not find them. Before I seal this, I will pick a wild flower off the bank of the Rio Grande and send you. Do you ever see me anymore in your dreams? I am certain that you would not know me. I am as badly sunburnt as it is possible to be. Ulysses Grant.
In June of 1846, volunteers for Zachary Taylor's army were arriving by the shipload at Brazos, Santiago, the port near Matamoros. By the end of June 1846, 12,000 U.S. soldiers were camped along the Rio Grande. There were shortages of everything. Zachary Taylor now had fewer wagons than he had at Corpus Christi, yet his army had grown to 3 times the size. President Polk was running the war on a tight budget, and Taylor complained about the lack of support from Washington. The general's success on the battlefield had sparked talk of his running for president, and Taylor wondered aloud whether he was the victim of political intrigue.
I might suppose there was an intention among the high functionaries to break me down. The large force now under my command will, from design or incompetency of others, have to return to their homes without accomplishing anything. The responsibility will be thrown on me, General Zachary Taylor.
In spite of the shortages, Taylor pressed forward with the campaign. In July, he ordered his troops to the village of Camargo, upriver on the Rio Grande. From Camargo, Taylor planned to march on the city of Monterrey to the southwest. Some of the troops traveled by river, packed into the sweltering holds of leaky steamers. Others suffered through a brutal journey overland.
We marched with a burning sun overhead and burning sand beneath our feet. Not a drop of rain had fallen, and the dust hung over our heads with smothering denseness from which there was no escape.
In Camargo, the soldiers found no relief. The town was surrounded by limestone rock that radiated a stifling heat. The drinking water had been contaminated by a springtime flood. Most of the volunteers knew nothing about camp sanitation. Many became sick. Soon, they started to die. Men who had left their homes to sacrifice themselves in glorious battle died instead from diarrhea and dysentery.
Scarcely a day elapsed that the muffled drums did not announce the departure of one or more poor fellows to the chaparral. The Dead March was ever in our ears.
Another young officer named George McClellan was horrified. They die, he said, like dogs. Soldiers reported that the death march was heard so often that mockingbirds whistled it back to the troops as they passed by. 1 out of every 8 soldiers, 1,500 in all, perished at Camargo. Almost as many as would die in battle during the entire war. On the 19th of August, 1846, the first of Zachary Taylor's troops left Camargo for Monterrey. The march was unbearably hot, but Major Philip Barber consoled himself with thoughts of his wife, Mattie. A few months earlier, the two had been together in Galveston, Texas.
Never in my life have I enjoyed so much happiness. My dear Mattie was perfectly overcome with joy and seemed to cling to me during the whole stay with her, as though a separation would be death. God grant that this war may soon terminate and we may again be permanently united.
September 4th. No letters today from my husband. I expect he is on the march for Monterrey. The next arrival will, I hope, bring me word of his safe arrival there.
Zachary Taylor had been forced to march from Camargo with only 6,600 troops. Almost half the army had been left behind. Many of the volunteers were still sick, and pack animals were scarce. To his great embarrassment, Lieutenant Ulysses Grant had been assigned to manage the mule trains.
I'm not aware of ever having used a profane expletive in my life. But I would have the charity to excuse those who may have done so, if they were in charge of a train of Mexican pack mules at the time.
At Monterrey, the city prepared to defend itself. The provincial capital of 10,000 had been reinforced with more than 7,000 soldiers led by General Pedro de Ampudia. Ampudia and many of his troops had fought at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. Here, they were determined to stop the invaders. On September 15th, with the U.S. Army less than a week's march from the gates of the city, Monterrey celebrated the eve of Mexico's Independence Day.
As night fell, we faced an enemy proud of its victories, in the midst of our own fears. A night when our most tender memories of home and independence were revived. The military bands announced the solemn hour in which our birth as a nation was proclaimed. All bowed to the sentiment of patriotism. They forgot all else and longed for the fight, for revenge, and for glory. Guillermo Prieto.
On the 19th of September, camped in a shady grove the soldiers called Walnut Springs, Taylor and his generals went over their strategy. The U.S. Army was deep in enemy territory, facing a city of well-protected defenders. Taylor decided on a risky plan. He would split his army into two. While Taylor directed a diversionary attack on the city's east side, General William Worth would attack the west. There, Worth would capture the high ground on two hills called Federation and Independence. The road to Saltillo would be cut off, and with it, any hope of Mexican reinforcements. That night, Major Philip Barber and his fellow soldiers prepared for battle.
The city has to be carried, and the bayonet will probably have to do the work. We must anticipate immense slaughter, but I feel calm and collected, having long since made up my mind that my life is the rightful property of my country and cannot be taken from me or preserved except by the fiat of the great God who gave it. Major Philip Barber.
On the morning of the 21st, U.S. troops launched a diversionary attack on the city's east side. Almost immediately, Taylor's plan fell apart. Inexperienced commanders charged too close to the defending positions, leading their men into a murderous crossfire. Mexican guns swept the field from 3 directions.
Our soldiers charged over the barricades, over the bodies of our enemies, over the haze of tainted blood, rose to the heavens the triumphant shouts of "Viva Mexico!"
"394 U.S. soldiers were killed or wounded. Among the dead was Major Philip Barber. Some wrote that he was killed instantly, shot through the heart. Others said that in his last moments, he thought of Maddie.
When struck by the ball that caused his death, he immediately drew from his bosom his wife's miniature, opened it, and exclaimed, "Tell her I died on the field of victory," put it to his lips, and instantly expired. Captain Kirby Smith.
While the unexpectedly bloody fighting raged on the city's east side, General Worth's troops attacked both Federation and Independence Hills on the west. The battles were hard fought. Later, a Texas Ranger would say, "I have never called a Mexican a coward since." Mexican defenders on top of Independence Hill raked the U.S. troops with cannon and musket fire from a large fortified building called the Bishop's Palace.
Our men took after the infantry. The Texans were invaluable and brave as lions. They pursued so hotly that they entered pell-mell with the enemy into the palace before they could close their doors. The Mexican tricolor flag was hauled down, and soon the star-spangled banner waved. Lieutenant Napoleon Dana.
With the road to Saltillo cut off, U.S. troops now penetrated Monterrey from both the east and the west, fighting their way street by street towards the center. The houses were made of stone. Each had become a small fortress. Mexican defenders fired from rooftops and windows. Bullets rattled like hail on the street. One soldier said it was as if bushels of hickory nuts were being hurled on them. Amid the chaos, soldiers remembered isolated acts of mercy as though they had occurred in a dream.
I saw a Mexican female carrying water and food to the wounded men of both armies. I saw her lift the head of one poor fellow, give him water, and then take her handkerchief from her own head and bind up his wounds. I heard the crack of 1 or 2 guns, and she, poor good creature, fell. She was dead. I turned my eyes to heaven and thought, "Oh God, and this is war."
By mid-afternoon, the U.S. soldiers had nearly reached the central plaza. Shells were landing dangerously close to the cathedral, where explosive ammunition had been stored. That night, General Ampudia requested a truce. Taylor demanded complete surrender, but promised generous terms. Ampudia made the most of the opportunity, persuading Taylor to agree to an 8-week armistice. The Mexican soldiers were allowed to keep all their arms except the heavy cannon. On September 25th, the Mexican army withdrew from Monterrey.
La salida
The departure of the Mexican army must have been dramatic, terrible. Perhaps it reminds me a bit of the departure from Tenochtitlan at the end of the siege of Hernán Cortés. That ailing and tattered caravan, dragging along in misery, carrying its sick, its wounded, and suffering the want of everything that would allow it to fulfill a denigrating, terrible agreement. Honorable, perhaps, but terrible.
When President Polk received news of the armistice, he was furious.
If General Taylor had captured the Mexican army and deprived them of their arms, it would have probably ended the war with Mexico.
But the president was forced to swallow his disappointment. The rest of the nation celebrated the Battle of Monterrey as a glorious victory. Printmakers, songwriters, and playwrights commemorated the battle in a grand and romantic style.
Especially popular was The Maid of Monterrey.
The moon was shining brightly upon the battle plain. The gentle breeze fanned lightly the features of the slain. The guns had hushed their thunder, the drum in silence lay. When came the señorita, the maid of Monterrey.
But for the families of the Mexican and U.S. dead, there was no romance to be found in war.
The poor private died unnoticed and unknown. Yet by some quiet hearthstone far from the tumult of cities, tears will be shed for his fall. The stern old father will nerve himself to his loss by the thought that the sacrifice was made for his country, while the aged mother's heart bleeds with a wound time cannot heal. Thomas Bangs Thorpe.
In December of 1846, a grieving widow in Galveston, Texas, read a letter from Monterrey.
Mrs. Philip N. Barber, my dear friend, may God grant you support and consolation under the weighty affliction that has befallen you. The loss you have sustained is alike irreparable to the regiment and the country.
By the fall of 1846, there were some in Mexico who had started to wonder if God had turned his back on their country. It seemed the United States invasion could not be stopped. Still, Mexico would neither surrender nor negotiate. In the United States, President James K. Polk needed desperately to bring the war to an end. A new strategy was required, something bold and decisive, an assault on the very heart of Mexico, Mexico City itself. The operation would be carried out by a man many considered the most brilliant soldier in the United States Army, General Winfield Scott.
But between Scott and Mexico City would stand the one person able to unite Mexico and turn back the invader.
The exiled general and former president of Mexico, Antonio López de Santa Anna.
This documentary series has been made possible by grants from the following: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the annual financial support from viewers like you, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Summerlee Foundation, and the following organizations and individuals.
This is History's Best on PBS.
As Mexico faces the U.S. invasion, Santana returns from exile to rally his country.
Mexicanos, the national cause is infinitely just. Not the Americanos, but you will decide her destiny.
Next, on the U.S.-Mexican War.